Hi, this is Jamil. Making Peace Visible is the only podcast that explores the intersection of peace, conflict, and the media. Peace efforts are invisible, and we're trying to change that. Our parent organization, also called Making Peace Visible, is a 501c3 nonprofit. Please consider including us in your holiday giving. You can make a one-time donation or spread out payments with a recurring donation. Your contributions help support this podcast and our mission to expand global coverage of peace efforts in the media. Learn more at makingpeacevisible.org and hit the donate button to contribute. Thanks so much.
War is happening, but normal life or normalized life is happening alongside war. And so we want to talk about it, and we want to show not just the spectacular events, but also how people live through it on a day-to-day level.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has promised to end the war in Ukraine. He's also said that he would cut off American military aid to Ukraine if the country doesn't begin peace talks with Russia. Ukrainians are divided on the question of whether to keep fighting. 52% of Ukrainians would like the war to end as soon as possible, even if it means conceding territory, according to a recent Gallup poll. At the same time, the war is getting bloodier. Both Ukraine and Russia have launched long-range missiles and are scrambling to secure territory before potential negotiations begin. As analysts and reporters speculate over Ukraine's fate under a second Trump administration, we're revisiting an interview that offers a different way of covering the Ukraine-Russia war. In February 2023, around the first anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, we spoke with two journalists who had already been covering the conflict in eastern Ukraine for years. Their work is focused on what's happening just off the battlefield, where life goes on between bombings. Writer Alisa Sopova and photographer Anastasia Taylor-Lind work as a team. Anastasia's photographs and Alisa's writing have a home on Instagram. They call the project 5K from the Front Line. They've also been published in places like Time Magazine, the New York Times, and NPR. Alisa, you're Ukrainian, and Anastasia, you're originally from Sweden, and now you live in the UK. You've been working together for several years. Tell us about how you met and decided to start working together.
It'll be 9 years this year since we met and we started collaborating. I first visited Donbass, the region in the east of the country, in 2014. When actually, quite by chance, I met Alisa through a mutual friend, and we stayed in touch.
Yeah, I want to say that we have a pretty different backgrounds, but at some point, I think our interests and our, I would say, dissatisfaction with how war, and specifically war in Ukraine, being reported, kind of converged. And so we were working first, I was a fixer, but we were spending a lot of time together and having conversations about what we were observing and what we were thinking about it. And we just found ourselves agreeing on many topics. As for our disagreement with the sensationalist approaches to reporting on war, as to the disbalance between the battlefield experiences with civilian experiences being underreported. And so somehow we never planned to start to launch some big project together, but somehow eventually we just started trying and experimenting and kind of looking for the ways to do it in a way that both of us saw right.
Well, you certainly have found some powerful ways to share your experience of the war. Alisa, for listeners who might not be familiar, could you explain the line going from the 2014 revolution in Ukraine to the Russian invasion in 2022?
Well, it's all very, very politically contested topic. Since early 2000s, Ukraine has been politically pretty divided. It's a little similar to the US, where there are two parties. And in Ukraine, there were also two parties, one more kind of associated with Western Ukraine, more like pro-Ukrainian, and the one associated with the east of the country which historically has been more Russian speaking, and many people saw themselves having more cultural ties to Russia. And then Maidan, and then people in the East kind of saw Maidan as a takeover of power by the other party. And so there was a lot of discontent in the East when Maidan happened. And then Russia, that was also unhappy with Ukraine drifting away from its influence. It kind of took over and began manipulating the sentiments in the east of the country to its own ends. And this is how in 2014 in spring, first Russia annexed Crimea, and then it started supporting separatist movements in the east of the country, eventually creating two entities called Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic that have been the epicenter of this kind of military struggle since 2014 until 2022 when the full-scale invasion started.
Anastasia, it's hard to describe photos in words, but since this is a podcast, let's try. I mean, I would describe your photography in Ukraine as intimate and humanizing. We're not seeing a lot of soldiers with helmets and guns drawn. We're seeing civilians gathered with their families or going about their daily lives. We see faces clearly, and the camera is close to the subject. And by the way, if you're listening and not currently operating a vehicle, you should take a look at their work on Instagram. The link is in the show notes. Anastasia, I'll let you take it from here. How would you describe your style of covering the war as a photojournalist?
Well, as Alisa's already mentioned, when we met each other, we suddenly and quite unexpectedly for me found some kinship in our professional approaches to reporting war. We are both interested in reporting on the war that is taking place in Ukraine, but we were also both concerned with the stereotypes and the tropes of the visual representation of war.
Mm-hmm.
When we think of wars, we think that of them as taking place within a war zone, a designated area with front lines and gray zones and no man's lands and second lines and third lines. And of course, these things do exist, but media coverage within these spaces tends to focus on the experience of combatants, and that really isn't Alisa or my interest. We're more concerned with what it's like to live with so many combatants from both sides. Suddenly in your garden, your street, your neighborhood, your town, and your region. As soon as war arrives in a place, us photographers begin representing the people whose lives are affected by it in different ways. And, we start putting people into categories within a pre-existing war stories, if you like. I might be defined now by my job. I'm a photographer. By my relationship to my family. I'm Daniel's sister. By the location that I live in. I'm a Hackney resident. But when war arrives, or when war arrived in Alisa's hometown, people are no longer defined in journalistic coverage in those ways. People become stories in a framework of war, combatants, civilians, separatists, terrorists.
Kind of like a pre-existing narrative almost.
Yes. You may notice it with the coverage of the Russian invasion, how often the conflict is compared to the Second World War. We're taking old narratives and laying new current stories over the top.
Alisa, your writing is published along with Anastasia's photographs in both your social media projects and your work that's been published in news outlets. You tell poignant stories of individuals that are rarely found in war coverage. How would you describe the stories you tell?
I would say that the underlying idea of what I'm trying to do always in war is kind of fighting against binaries and against these dichotomies that public discourse gets drawn down to under the circumstances of war. So the most initial one is war versus peace, right? And we think it's very obvious that war and peace are different things. And then we assume that like war is bad and peace is good. But then when you look at the current war from the perspective of Ukrainians, you begin asking yourself, where is resistance in this dichotomy? Then we look at bad guys against good guys, right? Or
right.
oppressor against the oppressed. One of the main questions of journalists, especially in war, is whether you can remain objective or whether you are biased. And kind of we consider that the ethically sound way is to say that we are biased, but towards the oppressed against the oppressor, right? But then when you look at the dichotomy of the oppressed versus the oppressor, it becomes very hard to identify who exactly falls in which category. It's kind of famous historical argument that in Stalin's repressions were suicidal because precisely people who were oppressors, who were persecuting other people, the next day, they were the oppressed. They were persecuted themselves. And in case of Ukraine, when I'm looking at it, I'm seeing kind of a hierarchy or a loophole of oppressors and oppressed, because inside of Ukraine is not a single entity. It's very heterogeneous. And then the civilians, these people in the East we are writing about, they actually end up being oppressed by both Russia and Ukraine, because Ukraine also discriminates against them because they speak Russian or have some cultural connections. And so basically, I'm just always trying to dig into the depths of this. I wanted to say to the bottom of it, but I can never find the bottom. But into the depths of this, of just like trying to get over this simplistic where everything is clear and all the roles are clearly designated. Because war is a very messy event and very messy environment. And I'm just trying to understand this messiness and to communicate it.
Your most recent social media project is called 5K from the Frontline, where you're telling stories about what's happening 5 kilometers from the front line of the war. If you go on Instagram and look at some of the comments, most are very supportive. But there was one comment that struck me. The person said they were worried that by showing people performing normal activities in the midst of a war, viewers could get the idea that war is not actually so bad. How would you respond to that concern?
I think basically, as somebody who has studied now some anthropological theory about the anthropology of war, this is one of the biggest questions that anthropologists struggle with too. How, because anthropologists view war and peace, again, not as opposites, but as something, as a continuity, as something that is happening simultaneously. War is happening, but normal life or so-called normal life or normalized life is happening alongside war. And so we want to talk about it, and we want to show not just the spectacular events, but also how people live through it on a day-to-day level. But then the ethical question is, how do you do it without normalizing war? And so there is no one answer. It's kind of an ongoing conversation, and it's I think we are also struggling with it every time. And people, and not only we as storytellers struggle with this, but people who live there, people who we work with, civilians who live in the war zone, they struggle with it too, because something that we've been running into very often is that people who live next to the front lines, they feel pressure to perform, to suit the stories of the war they see on the TV. For example, sometimes they take us to a picnic or to a celebration, or we just like have a nice hearty dinner, with a glass of wine. And then when Anastasia wants to take pictures, people become hesitant and they say, "Oh, please don't show us having fun while war is happening," because they know, they feel this pressure. They're afraid to be judged, to be immoral by having fun.
Absolutely, and also I should say that Alisa and I are not the only journalists working in Ukraine making stories about the war there. And because of the work of our colleagues, international and Ukrainian, we are able to make more nuanced long-term stories. So what can we add in terms of journalistic reporting? Well, we have communities and families who, at that point, we'd already been following and telling the story of their daily lives for 5 years.
My next question, in a sense, it returns to something you both talked about earlier. You know, on this podcast, we look at the way news media covers peace and violence. And something we've heard from experts and journalists is that the black and white narratives where one side is the hero and the other is the villain, not only do they not tell the whole story, but they actually seem to encourage support for violent conflict. I mean, in Ukraine, Russia is clearly the aggressor, but still some nuance is lost in the international reporting, which tends to be pro-Ukrainian.
Yeah, I'm thinking it even more specifically that relates to our work in Donbass. And it's something that Alisa wrote about last summer. It's a specific concern, and that is what happens when territory that has been occupied by Russian troops, Russian forces, is then reclaimed by Ukraine. And the question, it's a very pressing question, sits around whether the people who stayed there will be seen as hostages of the occupying Russian forces, or if they will be seen as collaborators. And this is a question that's relevant not only to territories that were taken by the Russian army, areas of Ukraine that were taken by the Russian army since the full-scale invasion and then reclaimed by Ukraine, but also these territories that have been occupied since 2014, Crimea and parts of Donbass. Right. And that is something that no amount of nuance in, I'm afraid about what will happen, and I'm afraid about the stories we will tell around that, because using the idea of the good and the bad is simply unacceptable, certainly in terms of journalism. But we see it even now. This is anecdotal, but I will give you an example from my own experience, even working last summer in Donbass. I would hear other media professionals referencing different towns or villages and describing them as, oh, they're pro-Russian there. The insinuation being that it's a dangerous place to go as a journalist. And this prejudice, from people who are telling stories. Of course, as we already mentioned, we all have biases. None of us are objective because we are human beings. But that specific reporting, the stories that we'll tell about what happens there, and beyond the stories, what happens there frightens me.
When you hear about some of the atrocities that were committed as the Russians left some of these towns that they had captured, it's hard not to be inflamed by the horror stories that you hear.
Mm-hmm.
Let me add something to what Anastasia said. I don't know, you might... Yeah, I will say something that is maybe sounds a little rude, but I was recently talking to my American friend and kind of trying to explain to him that just on this very casual, friends level, and trying to explain to him that things are not as clear and straightforward and black and white. And I made my points by saying that, look, both Russia and Ukraine are full of shit. But on top of that, Russia is just like deeply existentially wrong by what it's doing. And what I mean by that is that it's very hard to say such things, especially publicly, because you're not supposed to criticize the good guy in the war. And on one level, Russia is obviously doing the wrong thing by attacking Ukraine. And Ukraine is kind of a good guy here. But when we look at Ukraine again, it's not like it's good or bad, but we expect the good side to be like morally right in everything it does. And it's just not how things work. What I'm seeing now in Ukraine is that society is getting increasingly radicalized. There are people who speak Russian or people who come from the eastern regions of Ukraine are constantly harassed in public sphere. I myself being stopped at the checkpoints or at the border entering the country and being harassed because I have a residential record from Donetsk, from the east of the country. Something that I'm seeing in the public discourse all the time are discussions of like whether my hatred is enough. Oh no, your hatred to Russia is not enough. If you're not saying that all Russians should die, your hatred is not enough. And it's not that Ukraine, it means that Ukraine is bad, Ukraine should be invaded by Russia. Something problematic here is that, Russian propaganda, all the tropes of Russian propaganda, they are manipulative, but they're not entirely untrue. They are based on some, if not facts, then sentiments of the fact that like half of Ukraine is Russian speaking. And these people might not feel included in the nation building project of Ukraine. And the current resolution that everybody who is Russian speaking must switch to Ukrainian, everybody should self-flagellate and deny their identity of coming from Donbas region or from Crimea. I don't think it's going to work in Ukraine's interest.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the nature of war to reduce your opponent to a thing, to a stereotype of some kind.
Yeah, but the problem here is that we are not reducing just Russia to a thing. We are reducing a part of Ukrainian population that is suffering equally from Russian aggression. We are also treating them as collaborators and reducing them to and dehumanizing them effectively.
Right.
And it's generally like the most of the theater of war is in the east of the country, where all these Russian-speaking people live. And so they're getting the worst from Russia, and they're also getting the worst from Ukraine.
You know, it's become harder and more expensive to get close to the front lines in Ukraine as the war has progressed. What's next for each of you? Let's start with Alisa.
I'm continuing my PhD program starting September, and soon, maybe in a year from now, I will go to Ukraine for a 1-year-long field work as an anthropologist. But every time I spend time in Ukraine, I'm also reporting as a journalist. So I will be trying, like, as I've been doing so far, to do some kind of hybrid combined work of being an anthropologist and being a journalist. When I'm there, I'm sure Anastasia will come also and we will do some work together.
Great.
So we will continue working on that as well.
Yes. In December 2022, it was the first time I made a reporting trip on 5K from the front line without Alisa. It's a very new experience for me.
I'll bet.
And of course, I wasn't 5 kilometers from the front line anymore because many of the families we've been following have fled. Typically, they are separated along gender lines, with women in one place and men in another. And so I was with all of the people who we now call our friends. And the project is very, very much ongoing.
The Grinic family that you've covered for a long time, some of the photos are so prosaic of them having a picnic in a field that's only a few hundred yards from a battle zone. They're so, you see the kids playing in the field and having a picnic, and meanwhile the war is continuing. And I guess you're gonna get to know their children and the impact of the war on them.
And already we've just seen the kids grow up. Kirill was a little toddler who still had a bottle when we first met them. And the last time I saw him, 6 weeks ago, he was in kindergarten. He's going to start school this September in Poltava, where the family fled to escape the fighting in Avdiivka.
Right. I mean, in a microcosm, it's how does the war impact all these children? It is so devastating when you think about it. What they're going to grow up with.
It is devastating. Yes.
Go ahead.
I want to add to, like, we return again and again, I think, to this kind of idea of prolonged reporting, right? And returning to the same people. And I just kept thinking about it through our conversation in a way that before working as a journalist and then also working as a fixer, I was always I felt very bad about just coming and visiting these people. And often for these people who live in the rural area, this big team of American journalists with cameras coming in, it's like a big event, and they cook food and they offer food and they offer everything and they are very hospitable and they're very excited. And then in half an hour, the producer says, we have to go on, and they just turn away and leave and never look back at these people. And so when we started reporting with Anastasia in this more slow, a little slower way, I think we started returning to many of these people, not necessarily to report, but just because we were again back in the same town. And we could just as well return a visit to Lena and just have a tea together and talk about things. And then as soon as we already were there, Anastasia would take out her camera and take some pictures. And so it was not like a plan to return to the same people, but we were just returning to them as to our friends and as to somebody who we wanted to see again. And then we just took pictures and wrote down their stories kind of along the way.
But Alisa is absolutely right. Looking back from here now in 2023, we can explain it to you very well about how our project came about. Right. But of course, we
things are so often clearer in the rearview mirror.
Right. And I should tell you that all of this work was self-initiated and self-financed. We weren't going on assignments for anyone, we were just and as the years went on and our editors asked us in this interim period between the active phase of the war in 2014-15 and the full-scale invasion, editors would ask us, okay, you have a new chapter to the project, nice stories, nice pictures, but what's the news hook? What's the news angle? What's changed? And in reality, very little had changed. If I could have come up with a news angle or a new approach or any of those things, sure, I would have done that. But in the absence of anything else to do, we just kind of kept going. And now I don't see why we should stop. And so I think it's also worth going back over everything, because there were times when we just went for dinner. I think we went for dinner and I took a few pictures, but I never, thought to include them in an edit. But actually, now that we know they're not at home anymore, that their house has been hit again, that their neighbors are living in their basement with Lord the dog, who's paralyzed on his back legs and probably won't last very long, in a house, incidentally, that was occupied by a German officer in the Second World War. Suddenly, when I find these pictures, right?
Yeah.
So when I find the pictures, those summers and those dinners that Alisa explained, sitting for hours, talking and drinking homemade wine, and eating, delicious barbecued food, like they're further away than only 3 or 4 years now, and so the experiences. I mean, who am I to say this? Alisa grew up in Donbass, so but even for me, just the idea of where I spent my summers with my dear friends,
Right.
Yeah, certain things acquire additional meaning only post factum, when we know that they don't exist anymore or they came to some tragic end or whatnot. But you only have these things that didn't seem important at the moment and are important now. You only have them if you kept going to places and people and things that didn't seem important at the time to anyone, and did something that looked very obscure and uninteresting and not newsworthy. This is basically what our project is.
No, I mean, I would say that you are an anthropologist, because the kind of work you're doing, what has turned out to be a long-term study of people who are living in very, very challenging circumstances, is a form of anthropology. It's a form of study of a culture and how it survives in a very difficult situation. No, it's really remarkable. And I'm so glad that some of the articles that you've published, like in Time and the New York Times, have been long articles. They've really given you the breadth to get much closer to telling the whole story.
Well, after doing both journalism and anthropology and ethnography, which is the main anthropological, the practice of anthropology, the method, I realized that actually these two activities are very close, and they could, if they interpenetrated a little more, there could be a lot of useful insights that they could share. And it's a shame that anthropology and journalism are not as close to each other as they could be. For example, something that is, I think, would be very useful to journalism is the method of participant observation. Just kind of being there and trying to become a part of the scene and just doing whatever people are doing. Whatever people who you study, whatever they are doing it together with them. You participate and you observe and you do it together. And this is something that I think if I just thought this way before when I did pure journalism, it would be very useful, because the journalist, you often just feel pressured to come and quickly interview somebody. And if it just occurred to me 10 years ago that I don't have to leave when the interview is finished, and I could just spend even another couple hours and just stay there and ask, can I just hang out around and look at you doing things? Maybe I can be helpful in something. Maybe I can make you tea. You learn through just being there. And I think it could be very enlightening for journalism to engage more through such methods.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you both very much for participating in this interview and for sharing your insights and your perspective on a very horrific situation in the Ukraine. And good luck to both of you in terms of your future work together.
Thank you so much for inviting us, Jamil. And for your podcast, I listened to some series of it, and I find it very useful and very enlightening too.
Yeah, thank you sincerely.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You can find links to some of Anastasia and Alisa's reporting and their social media projects in the show notes. The Making Peace Visible podcast is produced and edited by Andrea Maraskin, with help from Faith McClure. I'm Jamil Simon. Once again, if you can, please go to makingpeacevisible.org and hit the donate button to support this podcast. You can also help out if you're listening on Apple Podcasts by giving us a rating and review, and sending the podcast to a friend always helps. Thank you so much, and talk soon.